Westminster Confession. We're moving now into chapter 7, which is one of the most important chapters in the whole Westminster Confession. And it ties together so much of the theology of Westminster because it is addressing the topic of the covenant. And in fact, the theology of Westminster is often called covenant theology because the covenant is really the theme that answers what is the overarching story of the Bible? What is the Bible about? And of course, the simplest answer to that is that the Bible is about Christ, about Jesus. But the covenant helps us understand the work of Christ, how we have a relationship with Christ, and what Christ has done for us. So this is an incredibly important chapter. I'm excited to share it with you. So chapter 7, paragraph 1 says this: "The distance between God and the creature is so great that although reasonable creatures do owe obedience unto him as their creator, yet they could never have any fruition of him as their blessedness and reward, but by some voluntary condescension on God's part." Now, one of the things this is saying is many of you have maybe heard it said that Christianity is about having a relationship with God. And of course, that is true. God wants us to have us as his beloved children, and that we would love him and he would love us, and we would know him and he would know us. It's a relationship. But here we see that it's not obvious how a creature, lowly creature like us, has a relationship with the almighty, wise God. And the only way that that is possible is that God would come to us. That's the language of condescension. It's like an adult who gets down on their knee to talk to a child and connect with them. God has to come down to us. And how does he come down to us to initiate a relationship with us? Well, it says, which he had been pleased to express by way of covenant. Now, a covenant is a relationship that is built on promises by the two parties, and it is built on oaths. And so each party has obligations that they commit to one another in order to hold together the relationship. And covenant was a theme in the ancient world when a mighty king would rescue a lowly kingdom, and the lowly kingdom would now have to give their service to this mighty king. And the mighty king would then make a treaty with the lowly kingdom and say, well, I've rescued you, now you owe me your obedience. And so we are going to form a covenant. And the covenant would tell the story of all the things that the mighty king did for the lowly king. And then it would list out all of the things that the lowly king has to do for this king who had saved them. And this document that wrote all this out was called a covenant. And actually, if you read the Bible is structured around these exact kinds of treaties. You know, the books of Genesis and Exodus tell the story of how God rescued the people of Israel, and he brought them to himself, and he was the king who had rescued them out of slavery. And so he gave them these laws and the 10 Commandments, and he told them to build this temple, the tabernacle was a tent that he would live among them. And so what he was doing was he was forming a covenant relationship with us. Of course, the New Testament is the same way. It begins with an account of how Jesus, our King, has saved us in the Gospels. And then the letters of the apostles tell us about how we live out our Christian life within the covenant with God and his church and obedience to him. And so what the covenant does is it gives an overarching narrative of the promises that God has given to us. And the main promise that God has given to us is, I will be your God and you shall be my people. That's how the Bible ends in Revelation 21. God says that in the new heavens and the new earth, he will be our God and we will be his people. And so probably the best analogy that we have in our modern day for a covenant is a marriage. Marriage is where two people come together and they take vows that bind them together. And so their relationship even though they might have the ups and downs in the marriages and they have fights and sometimes they feel more intimate than others, it's all within the security of this covenant relationship. And that's how God is with us. He knows that our spiritual lives are going to go up and down, and we're going to wander, and we're going to sin. And so he gives this stable structure of a covenant. He says, I have bound myself to you with these promises. And what we'll find as we go on is that all the promises of the covenant find their yes, find their answer, find their fulfillment in the person of Jesus Christ. And so I'll leave you with this question. Why do you think God would establish his relationship with us based on the promises of a covenant?